Norse religion, this is a term you are still going to find in scholarly research, although it has been questioned a lot, and with good reason. We basically use it to simplify things, but the term in itself is not really appropriate when investigating pre-Christian beliefs and ideas and mentalities. So to go a little bit to the etymological part, so religion would be the idea of connecting, of linking the world to a transcendent sphere, and this concept is actually very much linked to Christianization. The concept was spread throughout academia in the 19th century, but it has some limitations because the ancient peoples, since we're talking about Old Norse religion, the Vikings in our case, didn't really use this term to designate their own religion. They used either fornsider, meaning old customs, or later on you can also find the term heiðinsiðir, so heathen customs. The problem with this, let's say, systems of beliefs or a system of ideas, is first and foremost the fact that it is very hard to retrieve the performative aspect of it. So whatever has to do with cult and ritual and behavior, practice, what people actually did with the myths and whatever it is they believed in, because the texts, the written sources recording parts of Old Norse religion mostly deal with mythology. So for that, you need to resort to either archaeological sources, or you need to resort to comparisons with related practices, for example, from the Sami shamanism, to retrieve some ideas about Old Norse sorcery or magical practices, for instance. So for that matter, whenever you talk about Old Norse religion, we actually refer first and foremost to Old Norse mythology. And what does that mean? Well, that means the pantheon, so the gods and other beings, minor beings. I will come back to that a little bit later. And then we have the concept around the world. What is the world like? How does it function? So we have the cosmological aspect, the creation of the world, and then perhaps much more important than this, in the case of Norse mythology, is how the world is going to end, the eschatological aspect of it. So we do have some systematized accounts. We have the Prose Edda, which is in fact the source most people use when wanting to know more about this mythology. This has an author by the name of Snorri Sturluson, but there is also other evidence much closer to the Viking Age, for that matter, which is, for example, skaldic poetry or Eddic poetry. For that matter, we also have a couple of rune stones dealing with mythology, although I must insist that it is not really a main source of mythology, because most rune stones actually have a practical reason for being erected, not necessarily linked to religion. And like I said before, it's also very important to try to corroborate whatever we find in Eddic poetry or skaldic poetry with archaeological sources, in order to test what was written in the 13th century, because that would be the main problem, the problem of continuity and distribution. It's very hard to use 13th century sources in order to retrieve a world referring to mentality which was in fact in the 9th or 8th century, or even earlier. And the second problem would be that of distribution, because when you say Scandinavia, you're referring to a very, very vast space, and the probability of these beliefs and myths to have been circulating in the exact same form is actually very, very low. Okay. So we have this aspect of myth-based religion, and then we have the ritual-based approach. So what expressions, what practical expressions people find in order to transfer the mythological discourse into practice, into cultic practice, and other types of societal definitions. For example, the importance of myths in I don't know, elaborating legislation in lawmaking, for example, or in establishing the authority of kings, and so on and so forth. So whenever we talk about religion, whether Norse or anything else, it is also a question of power and ideology, and how religion translates into this more political aspect. Okay. So I already mentioned the difficult relationship between archaeological artifacts and Icelandic texts. Icelandic texts, there were writings in other parts of the northern world as well, but the main corpus on which we can retrieve this, particularly mythology, was written actually in Iceland in the Middle Ages, so beginning with the 13th century and going further on to the 14th and 15th century. It is presumed, however, that although these texts are pretty new, that there was some kind of common ground, like people used to transfer to one another generationally oral traditions. Despite some narrative variation, there would have been some kind of common ground. Now, why Icelanders in particular did that is also an interesting question. I suppose it didn't always have to do with the fact that it was dark and gloomy and they were bored and had nothing better to do than start writing stuff. It also had to do with the fact that Iceland, well, except for some Irish monks, was not really populated before the Vikings, and then the Norse plus some Celtic elements came there, and the Norse felt the need, to show the fact that they have some kind of history, some kind of ancestry, continuity, and so on and so forth. And they started, after Christianization, after the development of literacy in Iceland, they started to investigate their own past, and Viking mythology / religion was also part of their past, so that's why they insisted on this as well. All right, so it has to do a little bit with this idea of collective memory. For that matter, speaking about this discontinuity in terms of geography and distribution in time, there is, I think, a better term of designating the world of beliefs in the Viking Age, which is religiolect. It's a term used by scholar Neil Price precisely to reiterate this idea that we're not dealing with a unified product. We're dealing with some kind of attempt to structure everything post-Christianization. So that's why usually we need to be careful what we actually mean when using this term, Old Norse religion. Very broadly speaking about the context, so geographically we are dealing with the North Germanic space. This space was dominated by small villages, sedentarization, forms beginning with the first century, at least with the first century AD, development specifically in the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark and the Skåne area in Sweden. And then we have a development of later urban centers and movements toward the north, important towns, for example, in the Viking Age with older roots than the Viking Age would be, for example, Ribe, Sigtuna, Birka, and nowadays in northern Germany, Hedeby. Very broadly speaking, we have pre-Bronze Age a battle axe or boat axe culture developing between 2800 and 2300 BC. Then we continue with the Bronze Age, and in the Bronze Age we also have some let's say religious patterns which are more or less deciphered, but which show that there was both continuity and discontinuity. I can think of one element, for example. Here you can find a lot of picture stones in the Bronze Age depicting the sun. all kinds of suns. And if you move forward to the Viking Age, you are going to find the sun in a very rare context, so it no longer occupies the important position from the Bronze Age. That's just one example. All right, then moving on, we have the pre-Roman and Roman Iron Age, and then the migration period. And from the migration period, we can also link uh, the Scandinavian mythology with, more broadly speaking, Germanic mythology, although that's not really a term which is very used nowadays, because it presupposes this idea of unbroken, unified religious system, which was really not the case. So it's one thing when Tacitus tells us something about divination practices with the tribe of the Bructeri, for example, in the 1st century, and a very different thing when we read about what the Nornir did with runes carved on pieces of wood in the Voluspor, which is 900 years later at least. So we can't really make a very clear connection, but there would have been, let's say, some kind of common ground, which then developed in different directions. And then we come to the Viking Age, and because it's called Old Norse Religion, it refers to the beliefs predominating in the Viking Age. So that would be roughly between 800 and 1000. So orientation 1066 is considered in historiography to be the end of the Viking Age, but then again, these dates can be fluid, and they're just used to oversimplify some very complex situations. Old Norse religion is at the intersection of the Christian world and then, like I mentioned before, the Sami world. There are a lot of hints at the fact that the Sami, in particular with reference to magic and shamanism, did influence Old Norse religion, but I will come back to this later. Linguistically speaking, we also have a development from Proto-Germanic to Proto-Norse and Old Norse. Old Norse being the language actually spoken by the Vikings. But mind you, we also have a collection of variants here. There was a split between East Old Norse and West Old Norse, and before that, there was an even more complicated situation. And also, mind you, that we have a development from the alphabet known as the Elder Futhark to the alphabet used in the Viking Age, which is the Younger Futhark. And speaking of this, the runic inscriptions date around the 100 or 200. We have the Vimosacom, for example, and very excitingly, a new discovery, the Idibaruk runestone. That's a discovery from this year. As a matter of fact, it is the oldest runestone, and it's written in the Elder Futhark. But I also have a slide about runes a little bit later, just as a reminder. Speaking of the Viking Age, well, you have area of population in basically southern Sweden and Norway and the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark, but then they tended to spread pretty much everywhere. So going towards Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland in Canada, and then also traveling east to the territory of Ukraine, for example, and all the way to the east to the Caspian Sea, so linked to the process of state formation in the eastern parts of Europe, and they also traveled into the direction of Spain, Normandy, and Spain as well. So you can imagine that at least some of their mentalities and beliefs were also influenced by the fact that they spread pretty much everywhere. So why I'm telling that this is because when you find an account, for example, like that of Ibn Fadlan, from Baghdad, and when he's talking about his encounters with the Varangians in the east and talking about some funeral ritual, people automatically assume that that was a thing that all Vikings did. But that's really difficult to generalize. So he's talking about a very limited space and limited time. So pay attention whenever you find such kind of sources and descriptions. They're not that many, but we also need to take into account what a geographical area we are talking about. Okay. With the slides. No, I think I'll be able to retrieve it. Okay, cool. All right, so briefly speaking, what sources do we have about Norse mythology and generally speaking about Old Norse religion? So we do have a couple of runestones talking about different things such as the apocalypse. We have the Rök runestone, which is a very enigmatic story about the end of the world, hard to decipher. We also have the Karlevi runestone or the Ramsund carving. Here we have reference to a cycle of heroic poetry referring to the hero Sigurd. But please mind you that these runestones were primarily memorial stones, so their main purpose was not a well, it was a religious one if you think that they were commemorating somebody. But other than that, yeah, don't expect to find a great deal of information regarding religion and society for that matter. Then we have, of course, the Eddas, the prose and poetic Edda, which are the main written source for this mythology. And then we also have the saga literature. Saga literature usually considered to be far-fetched in its representation of mythological content. There are reasons to believe that is true because it is late literature, and it is literature, it's not history. Many scholars consider it to be, as a matter of fact, a reception history. So what people in the 13th, 14th, 15th century thought Viking Age, including beliefs, were like in the 9th and 10th century. So take it with a grain of salt. On the other hand, it would also be problematic if we completely ignore it, because we have some very interesting details. I can think, for example, of the saga of King Gautrek, where we have a reference to a sacrificial aspect. A king is being sacrificed so as to ensure the luck of his people. So these small details can help fill in some very important gaps. But yeah, take it with a grain of salt. We have the Islandiga Sögur, for example. These are the family sagas, so the more realistic ones. And then we have the legendary sagas, for example, the cycle of the Volsungs, the equivalent of the Nibelungs in Germanic tradition on the continent, the Fornalda Sögur. We have the Konunga Sögur, the sagas of the kings, and so on and so forth. More close to the Viking Age is the skaldic poetry. Skaldic poetry is a very complicated form of poetry written in the 9th and 10th century. Mainly, you can also find a sensational link now about skaldic poetry online, where everything has been digitalized with explanation, commentary, and so on. I can give you a link later if you want. At any rate, some examples include Theodulf of Finir with his poem Hauslong. We have perhaps more famously the poet Egil Skallagrimsson or Egil Skallagrimsson. In modern Icelandic pronunciation, he has the poem Sonatorek with all kinds of references to Odin, for example. And then we have Håkonarmál by Eyvind the Plagiarist, and Eiríksmál by Bragi Boddason. These are the more known ones. We also have the poem of Ragnar, for example, Ragnarstropa. Many more, but I did not include them on the slide. So these would be the local sources. And then we have some external sources also talking about some aspects of religion. But there is here, of course, the problem of Christian interpretation, and there is also the problem of what the chroniclers writing about this stuff really understood was going on. We have the Gesta Danorum, for example, written by Saxo Grammaticus, including the perhaps famous story of Prince Hamlet inspiring Shakespeare's Hamlet. And some more modern interpretations. And then we have Adam of Bremen with his Gesta Hamburgensis, where we have the reference to the temple, or what he believes to be a temple in Uppsala. Some legal texts, such as the Icelandic Grey Goose Law Code, the Krogos, can also be useful here, or various lists with kings. So these would be some of the written sources available to us. Other than that, we do have picture stones, particularly from the island of Gotland in Sweden. These have no runic inscriptions on them, so they are just pictures of either religious processions or some figures about whom we may or may not know who they are and what they're doing. Also some interesting symbols, such as the Valknut, although it was later called like that. And yeah, you can see a lot of question marks here, because there isn't really a certainty at any rate that these figures or scenes we so far identified actually matched what they were really in the age. So we have, for example, the Töngjagörda picture stone, the Storahamash picture stone, and also an interesting stone this time from Cumbria, so not from Scandinavia, probably depicting Loki. And speaking of sources from outside of Scandinavia, the Gosforth cross is also an interesting example. Here you can find a lot of mythological references which corroborate some stuff Snorri in his Prose Edda is talking about. For example, you can find the wolf Fenrir, the one who is going to kill Odin at the end of time, and he is being slain by Vidar, who is one of Odin's sons, born particularly for that purpose. All right. Besides these picture stones, you can also find small objects such as the famous Mjolnirs, the hammers of Thor, for example, in Ödeshög in Skåne, in Bredsätra, and so on. There is also a interesting figurine found near Akureyri in Iceland, probably depicting Thor, because he looks as if he were holding a hammer. Also some other figures. So, for example, the figure with Odin, probably Odin from later, because he's depicted on a throne. A figurine with a giant phallus, probably representing the fertility god Freyr, probably from Rellinge. And not only the gods are represented on these figurines, but also some minor deities, for example, Valkyrie, as the case in the discoveries in Tiso and in Horby. All right. Besides this, we also have some pre-Viking material that can be somewhat useful, although the function is unclear. We have a lot of figurines either engaging in social activities such as marriage, or being depicted with some kind of tools, or other stuff. We don't really know what they are. The tiny gold foils retrieved from sites such as Upakro, Sortmul, or Larvik. Their function, I repeat, is unclear, and it is also unclear whether they actually depicted deities, or maybe they just depicted some persons from the elite, something like that. Other sources include the Oseberg tapestry. This was retrieved from the burial from the 9th century in Norway, and you can find here a beautiful procession, what seems to be procession with chariots and figurines with horns reminiscent of other artifacts from previous ages, such as the Torslunda plates, probably with reference to some kind of ritual linked to shape shifting as well, and other magic practices. And last but not least, place names. Place names can also be very suggestive. In fact, there are some references in place names to deities about whom we know very little from Eddic mythology, such as the god Ullr. We have a lot of names such as Ulevi, and in Sweden in particular, and this shows that he might have been much more important than what we have left from Snorri or whatever Eddic poem, and so on. Another case would be the god Tyr. Yeah, the god Tyr is featured in a very important myth. He sacrifices his hand to the wolf Fenrir so as to ensure, let's say, cosmic order. But other than that, he doesn't really appear in other myths. However, the toponyms from Denmark, the large amount of toponyms from Denmark would suggest he was much more important than thought. His name as well is cognate with Zeus and Deus, so we might think, maybe he was more important than Odin at some point because of these cognates, but there isn't really any way of telling it for sure. And speaking of these artifacts and of the issue about continuity and when these people actually started worshipping the gods who are mentioned in poetry, we have a very important discovery from the Vindalev treasure hoard from Denmark. We have an inscription in the Elder Futhark, so it's not the Viking language, it's a little bit before that, with an elite figure, probably a warrior, chieftain, king, or something like that, and the inscription, he is Odin's man. So this connection between Odin as a representative of the elite and the higher social order of Scandinavia, pre-Viking Scandinavia, is made clear on this artifact. And this artifact is from the 5th century, as a matter of fact. And this is the most exciting thing. So from migration times, this constitutes, such artifacts constitute a bit of evidence that maybe not everything we have from the Middle Ages is some fantasy of a Christian author, which is why it is very important to take into account all kinds of archaeological artifacts when trying to restore some of these beliefs in God or in gods or other beings. Okay, so here you can see a couple of examples of the Mjolnir I mentioned before, in different shapes and sizes. So Bredsetra, Moheda, Skåne, Römerstall, and Raus. These hammers are usually in connection with the fact that Christianity started to spread, and they were molded as a reaction to the spread of Christianity. You can also find a lot of molds with the possibility to make both hammers and crosses. So people were kind of fluid with regard to their religious affiliation. So at least a couple of 100 years, I would say that Christianity was the official religion, but in terms of what people actually worshipped and believed in, things were a little more flexible. And this very childish-like drawing is actually part of a runestone, is the Altuna stone, and presumably it is also a representation of Thor, or at least of his hammer.